The galaxy feared human soldiers until they encountered Earth Special Forces. The radio crackled with a single word, and every alien in the command room went still. Sergeant First Class Daria Okonkwo had been watching them for the past hour. The Velthari officers with their tall, angular frames and pale silver skin. The Bryn delegates with 4 arms each, always moving, always gesturing, never able to stay completely still. The 2 Keth advisors standing in the corner like statues carved from dark stone. They had all spent the last hour talking about the Karate Dominion's newest fortress with the calm confidence of people who had already decided the situation was impossible. Then the message came through from Earth Command. Not a battle plan. Not a request for resources. Just 4 words, asset is in transit. Daria knew what that meant. Nobody else in the room did. She had served 11 years in the Coalition's Joint Operations Framework. She had fought alongside species from 14 different worlds. She had seen what fear looked like on a dozen different kinds of faces. And right now, watching Velthari General Sorithvel fold his long fingers together and say very quietly, "What asset, exactly?" she felt something she had not felt in a long time. Anticipation. Humanity had been part of the Galactic Coalition for 11 years. The first contact had not gone the way the old science fiction stories predicted. There were no laser battles in orbit, no dramatic standoffs between warships. There was a meeting, a translation period, a series of negotiations, and then slowly, carefully, humanity had been let into the larger conversation happening across the stars. The galaxy had been surprised by humans from the start. Not because humans were the strongest species, or the fastest, or the most technologically advanced. By most measures, humans were somewhere in the middle of the pack. What surprised everyone was the stubbornness. Daria remembered a Bryn officer explaining it to a new recruit once. He had said, with genuine confusion in his translated voice, "Your soldiers continue after they are hurt. We have documented cases of human soldiers continuing to function after damage that would cause neurological shutdown in any species we have previously studied. We do not understand the mechanism. The mechanism, Daria had thought at the time, is that we just decide to." That was the part no one outside of Earth could quite wrap their heads around. The fact that a human being, given a choice between stopping and not stopping, would very often simply choose not to stop. It was not a biological advantage. It was not a special gene or an enhanced nervous system. It was a decision, made in the worst possible moment, to keep going anyway. That reputation had spread. Over 11 years of coalition membership, human soldiers had fought in 7 major conflicts and dozens of smaller operations. The stories had grown. The Velthari told their young officers about the human platoon on Ridgeline 9 that held a position for 30 hours against a force 12 times their size. The Keth had a word for human soldiers that translated roughly as, "the ones who do not lie down." The Bryn had added human combat psychology to their required military education curriculum. The galaxy feared human soldiers. And that fear was completely justified. But it was also, Daria knew, only half the story. She stood near the back of the command room now, watching General Sorithvel read the briefing packet that Earth Command had transmitted alongside the asset notification. She watched his silver face go through several expressions she did not have names for. She watched him look up at the Keth advisors, then back down at the packet, then up at her. "Sergeant Okonkwo," he said. "Are these figures accurate?" She glanced at the packet. She had read it 3 hours ago. "Yes, sir." 12 personnel. "Yes, sir." For a fortified citadel with an estimated garrison of 200 Paincaster units and 27 coalition hostages. "Yes, sir." He looked at her for a long moment. His eyes were solid amber, no pupil, which made it difficult to read his expression the way she could read a human face. But she had been working with Velthari long enough to recognize the particular tilt of his head that meant he was deciding whether to argue. He decided not to argue. She respected that. The Karate Citadel Neth was, by every military analysis the coalition had run, a nearly perfect defensive installation. It sat on a moon with a thin but breathable atmosphere, built into the side of a mineral cliff face, with overlapping fields of sensor coverage and a garrison that had never lost a defensive engagement. 3 weeks ago, a karate raiding force had taken the coalition's research station at Yev 4 and moved the hostages there. The coalition had been negotiating ever since, and the Karate had been making increasingly unreasonable demands while slowly moving the hostages deeper into the facility. The coalition's military analysts had run 47 different assault scenarios. 39 of them resulted in hostage casualties. The other 8 required resources that would take 3 months to assemble and would trigger a response that could spiral into a full war neither side wanted. Earth Command had looked at the same problem and sent 12 people. Daria had a pretty good idea of what kind of 12 people they were. She had never worked with that particular community directly. In the Coalition's Joint Operations Framework, they operated under a classification level above her clearance. She had heard the stories the way everyone heard them, in fragments, in rumor, in the careful way that certain senior officers would sometimes go very quiet when a particular kind of operation was mentioned. She had met one of them once, briefly, 3 years ago on a station near the Outer Rim. She had not known who he was at the time. He had seemed completely ordinary. Average height, average build, unremarkable face. They had spoken for about 4 minutes about coffee, of all things, the difficulty of finding a decent cup this far from Earth. He had been funny, and easy to talk to, and completely relaxed. She had only found out afterward, from her commanding officer, who had seen the men leaving and gone pale, that she had just spent 4 minutes chatting with someone whose service record was 70% blacked out and who had been involved in 3 operations that officially had not happened. She thought about that man now, as General Sorithvel sent the asset arrival notification to the rest of the command staff and the room slowly began filling with more officers, more analysts, more people all coming to look at the same 4 words. Asset is in transit. The room was buzzing. The Bryn delegates were talking fast among themselves in their own language. The Keth advisors had finally moved from their corner and were standing over a display table, pulling up the Citadel Neth schematics again. Sorithvel was on a communication line with someone at Velthari High Command, his voice low and controlled. Daria walked to the observation window. The station's docking approach was visible from here, a long, dark corridor of space lit by the distant star and the running lights of 3 Coalition patrol vessels. Nothing moved out there. The transport was still hours away. She pressed her hand against the cold glass and looked out into the dark. Somewhere out there, 12 people were sitting in a transport that did not appear on any public manifest, wearing no unit insignia, carrying gear that had no coalition procurement codes. They were probably not doing anything dramatic. They were probably doing exactly what that man on the Outer Rim station had been doing when she met him. Something completely ordinary. She felt the anticipation again, sharper now. The galaxy feared human soldiers. It had no idea what it was about to learn. The transport appeared on the approach sensor at 0340 station time. Daria was still awake. She had not been able to sleep. It was smaller than she expected, a short-range personnel carrier, the kind used for quick insertions, with no external markings beyond a single string of numbers that meant nothing to any coalition database. It docked in Bay 7 without any communication beyond the standard safety handshake. No call sign. No crew announcement. Just the clunk of the docking clamps and the hiss of the airlock equalizing. She went to the bay. 12 people walked off the transport. They wore plain gray travel clothes, no uniforms. They carried personal bags, the kind anyone might carry on a long trip. They looked tired in the completely ordinary way that travelers look tired, not worn down, just in need of coffee and a good meal. A couple of them were talking quietly. One was reading something on a small personal device. Another was eating, of all things, a sandwich. Their team leader was a woman of medium height with short brown hair going gray at the temples and very calm green eyes. She looked at Daria once, a quick assessment, and then looked around the bay with the same quick efficiency. "Sergeant Okonkwo," she said. "Yes, ma'am." "Master Sergeant Calloway." "Where's the briefing room?" Daria pointed. Calloway nodded and started walking. The other 11 followed without a word, without any kind of formation or obvious order, just moving the way water moves when it finds a path, naturally, quietly, without wasted motion. Daria fell in behind them. She watched them move through the station corridor and tried to find the thing that was different about them. They were not obviously large or physically imposing. They did not carry themselves with the aggressive visible confidence she associated with soldiers preparing for something difficult. They did not scan every corner or keep hands near weapons they were not even wearing. They just walked. And yet something in her gut, trained by 11 years of conflict, said, something is very different about these people. She could not name it yet. She filed the feeling away and kept walking, and the corridor lights hummed overhead, and somewhere in fortified stone on a distant moon, 27 coalition citizens were waiting, not knowing that the thing coming to find them looked, from the outside, like absolutely nothing at all. Veth Carroll had spent 14 years studying humans. Not in the way a biologist studied a new species, though he had done some of that too, in the early days, when humanity had first joined the coalition and everyone was scrambling to understand the newcomers. He studied them the way a professional intelligence analyst studies a subject, methodically, exhaustively, with the goal of understanding how they think rather than simply what they do. He had written 3 reports for the Coalition Intelligence Directorate. The first, 7 years ago, had been titled Human Military Psychology, an initial assessment, it had concluded, with some confidence, that human aggression stemmed from a combination of evolutionary pressure and cultural normalization of conflict, and that while human soldiers presented unusual physical endurance profiles, their tactical decision-making was broadly predictable within standard coalition frameworks. He had believed that report when he wrote it. He was considerably less sure of it now. Veth Carroll was a Drell. His species was small, fine-boned, with large dark eyes adapted for low-light conditions on their home world and brains wired for pattern recognition in a way that most other coalition species found either impressive or unsettling, depending on the situation. He had 4 fingers on each hand, gray-green skin that darkened when he was stressed, and an eidetic memory that could recall any document he had ever read in perfect detail. He could recall, in perfect detail, every human he had ever observed. None of them had prepared him for what he was watching now. The briefing room held 14 people, 12 humans, himself, and a Velthari adjutant named Corithlin who was technically running the session on behalf of General Sorithvel. Corithlin was good at her job. She had opened with a crisp summary of the Citadel Neth situation, the hostage positions, the Karate garrison strength, the failed negotiation timeline. Veth Carroll had watched the 12 humans as she spoke. They were paying attention. He was certain of that. And yet the quality of their attention was wrong. It did not look like the focused alertness he associated with military professionals receiving a critical briefing. It looked more like. Veth Carroll searched his memory for a comparison. It looked like the way an experienced engineer listens to a problem description. Not reacting, not already forming responses. Just taking it in, storing it, waiting. The woman called Calloway sat at the center of the group. Not at the head of the table, that position was occupied by Corithlin, but in a position that made it obvious, without any visible signal, that this was the person in charge. She had a cup of something hot in front of her. She had not touched it. She had been reading the schematics on the room's display panel for the past 4 minutes without looking away. Veth Carroll timed it. 4 minutes and 17 seconds. Then she looked up and said, "What's the sewage reclamation cycle on this installation?" Corithlin blinked. Pardon. The waste processing system. How often does it cycle? What's the maintenance access pattern? Veth Carroll noted this with great interest. Corithlin pulled up a facility management subsection that, he was fairly certain, had never been accessed in the entire planning process for this operation. The answer, when it came up, was that the reclamation system cycled every 14 hours and the maintenance crawlways ran along the inner western wall of the facility, parallel to what the schematics labeled as secondary storage. Secondary storage was adjacent to the hostage wing. Calloway nodded, once, and looked back at the display. She did not explain what she was thinking. She did not share the connection she had just made. She simply filed it and moved on. Veth Carroll updated his mental model of her significantly. The questions continued. They were not the questions he expected. There were no inquiries about garrison troop quality, or about the karate paincasters that had been flagged as the primary tactical obstacle. There were no requests for updated intelligence on karate weapons loadouts. Instead, the 12 humans asked about shift change timing, about the mineral composition of the cliff face, about which sections of the facility had been most recently constructed and which were original build. One of them, a lean, quiet man who had been introduced as Corporal Harris, asked about the local wildlife on the moon's surface, specifically whether there were any species that moved in large groups at dawn. Corithlin answered patiently, visibly confused. Veth Carroll was not confused. He was riveted. He had studied human soldiers for 14 years. He had interviewed veterans, analyzed after-action reports, attended coalition joint exercises. He had catalogued human combat behavior across 7 conflicts and written extensively about human tactical psychology. And in all of that study, he had never seen this particular pattern, the systematic demolition of the obvious in favor of the unseen. Every other military professional in every planning session he had attended started with the main threat and worked outward. Threat assessment first, then response. The paincasters were the main threat. Everyone in the coalition military understood this. The paincasters were a karate biological unit, bred and trained specifically for combat, capable of transmitting a neurological disruption signal that caused immediate physical incapacitation in any species with a sufficiently complex nervous system. They had a range of about 40 meters, required line of sight, and were effective against every coalition species on record. The 12 humans had not asked a single question about the paincasters. He raised this, carefully, when Corith Lin opened the floor for final clarifications. The paincaster units, he said, looking at Calloway. Your assessment. Calloway looked at him. It was the first time she had looked directly at him since the session began. Her green eyes were calm and focused and reminded him, with a slight internal discomfort he could not entirely explain, of a deep-water predator on his home world that appeared to be resting until suddenly it was not. Handled, she said. Handled how? Corith Lin asked. Our analysis suggests they represent the primary obstacle to any entry operation. No coalition species has shown resistance to the neurological disruption effect. We know, Calloway said. She did not offer anything further. Veth Carroll noted that Corith Lin looked like she wanted to press the point and then decided not to. He respected that. He made the same decision. After the briefing, the 12 were shown to temporary quarters. Veth Carroll did not go to his own quarters. He went to the station's passive observation system, the network of low-priority environment sensors that monitored common areas for safety and maintenance purposes, and he watched. He told himself this was professional diligence. It was also, he admitted privately, simple fascination. What he observed over the next 6 hours was this. 3 of them cooked. A real meal, not from ration packs, using ingredients they had apparently brought with them. The smell was something Veth Carroll recognized as a human-spice combination he had encountered once before on a joint operations station, warm and complex and completely at odds with the environment of a forward military base. 2 of them played a card game. He did not recognize the game. It involved a standard Earth deck and a set of small carved tokens that one of them kept in a leather pouch. They played in near silence, communicating in the shorthand of people who have spent a long time in close company, brief words, small gestures, the occasional quiet sound of amusement. One of them exercised. Not the aggressive, high-intensity preparation exercise he had seen human soldiers perform before operations. Slow, deliberate movements. Almost meditative. One of them slept. One of them, the woman with close-cropped red hair who had been introduced as Specialist Greer, sat in the corner of the common area with a battered paperback book and read. Veth Carroll could not see the title. She read for 3 hours without stopping. At one point Harris, returning from somewhere, paused beside her and said something. She replied without looking up. He laughed very quietly and kept walking. Calloway sat at a small table near the viewport. She had the CitadelNet schematics open on a personal device, but she was not looking at them. She was looking out at the dark, with the expression of someone not thinking about anything in particular. Veth Carroll watched all of this for a long time. He had spent 14 years studying humans. He had a sophisticated and nuanced understanding of human military behavior. He could explain human aggression psychology, human unit cohesion dynamics, human physiological endurance profiles. He had written 3 reports and given 2 lectures and considered himself, quietly, one of the leading non-human authorities on human combat capability. What he was watching now fit none of his models. Every species he had studied prepared for danger the same way, in the same broad strokes, heightened alertness, increased group communication, behavioral signals of readiness. Even the variations were predictable. Some species became louder. Some became quieter. Some performed rituals. The Bryn checked and rechecked their equipment. The Velthari ran battle simulations. The Keth told stories about previous victories. These humans were doing none of those things. They were cooking and playing cards and reading and sleeping, as if tomorrow was simply tomorrow. And yet Veth Carroll had read their partial service records. He had seen what they had done. Not all of it, most of it was behind classifications he could not access, but enough. Enough to know that the woman reading the paperback had once, alone, completed an objective that 4 previous teams had failed to complete. Enough to know that the men sleeping so peacefully had once spent 11 days operating behind hostile lines with nothing but the gear he had carried in. Enough to know that Calloway, sitting quietly at her viewport, had a list of completed operations that ran to 2 pages before the redactions began. He updated his mental model again. Significantly. He went to his own quarters and opened his intelligence log and began writing. He wrote for a long time. When he reached the end of what he wanted to say, he read it back, found it insufficient, and added one more line. The line said, "I have studied the surface of this thing for 14 years. Tonight I begin to understand that the surface is not the thing." He closed the log, turned off the light, and lay in the dark for a very long time before sleep came. In the morning, 12 unremarkable people would walk out of this station toward something the entire coalition had assessed as impossible. Veth Carroll found, to his own considerable surprise, that he was not worried about them at all. What he felt, he realized as sleep finally arrived, was something closer to pity. For the karate. The first transmission came in at 0611. Daria was in the secondary monitoring room with 2 coalition communications analysts, a Brin named Vel something unpronounceable and a young human lieutenant named Gareth Cole who had the specific look of someone who had not slept but was refusing to admit it. They had 3 displays active, one showing the passive sensor sweep of the moon's surface, one carrying the encrypted shortband channel assigned to the team, and one running the coalition's live intelligence feed from the karate installation. The 0611 transmission was 4 numbers. Nothing else. Cole looked at her. "Is that?" "It's a position check," she said. "They're inside." Cole stared at her. The Brin analyst made a sound that Daria had learned, over time, meant significant surprise. Cole said, "They've only been on the surface for 90 minutes. Our original assessment said minimum 4 hours to approach, minimum another 2 hours to find any viable entry point. I know what the original assessment said." She watched the sensor display. Nothing. The surface showed the same thin atmosphere landscape it had shown for hours, rock, mineral dust, the faint infrared shimmer of the installation's heat signature deep in the cliff. No movement. No alerts. No indication that 12 people had just gotten inside a heavily fortified facility that the coalition's best military planners had spent 3 weeks failing to crack. The sewage reclamation system cycled every 14 hours. Calloway had known that before she ever set foot on the surface. Daria thought about that question in the briefing room, the question that had made Corathlin blink, and felt something she could only describe as professional admiration so strong it was almost uncomfortable. At 0638, the second transmission came. This one was longer, a sequence of 6 numbers and 2 letters that she and Cole had to decode together using the key that Earth Command had provided. It meant, Paincaster units neutralized. Proceeding to Phase 2. Cole's stylus stopped moving across his pad. The Brin analyst made the surprise sound again, more strongly this time. Daria looked at the message and felt the fine hairs on her arms rise. The Paincasters were supposed to be the impossible problem. The thing that ended every assault scenario. Every coalition military planner who had looked at Citadel Neth had come back to the same wall. The Paincasters cover every approach, every internal corridor, every room where the hostages are held. There is no known countermeasure. Any team entering the facility will be incapacitated before they can reach the objective. There is no known countermeasure. Daria thought about Calloway saying "handled" in the briefing room, and she thought about the fact that 12 people had apparently walked into a facility full of them and come out the other side unaffected, and she thought, they built their own. Before they ever got here, before they were even briefed on this specific facility, they already knew Paincasters were a possibility and they already had an answer for it. She felt the hair on her arms stay risen. At 0719, the karate installation's internal alert system activated. They could see it on the intelligence feed, a cascading series of notifications moving through the facility's network. The garrison was responding to something. Daria leaned forward, watching the alert propagate, counting the response signatures. Then, at 0723, the alert stopped. Not because the threat was resolved. Cole checked twice, certain there was a technical error. There was no technical error. Someone had cut the relay. They cut the internal alarm system, Cole said, very quietly, as if saying it too loudly might break something. Daria nodded. From inside. Yes. The next 40 minutes were the longest of Daria's professional career. The intelligence feed showed sporadic activity, garrison movement patterns that were confused and uncoordinated, the signature of a force responding to something they could not locate or understand. Twice the feed showed large groups of karate soldiers moving to positions, holding there, and then dispersing without any apparent engagement. Once there was a brief sensor spike in the facility's lower levels that lasted 11 seconds and then went completely quiet. At 0812, Calloway's voice came over the encrypted channel for the first time. She sounded, Daria would tell people later, the way someone sounds when they are describing the most ordinary thing in the world. All packages secured. 27, 27, 27. Proceeding to extract. Cole closed his eyes for a moment. The Brin analyst made a sound Daria had never heard before from that species. She would later learn it was the equivalent of profound relief expressed at high volume. Daria pressed the transmit key. Confirmed, Calloway. Extract window is clear. What is your status? Brief pause. 12 and 12. We have a souvenir. Copy on 12 and 12, all 12 operators, all 12 hostages. She almost did not ask about the souvenir, but her curiosity overrode her professionalism. Define souvenir. The garrison commander thought it would be more interesting if his personal protection animal was involved. It reconsidered. It's with us now. It's fine. Daria thought about the war beast that had been flagged in the facility briefing as an asset used by the karate garrison for 3 centuries of defensive operations. She thought about the word reconsidered. She said, copy that, and did not ask anything else. The extraction took 40 minutes. The team came off the surface in the same unmarked transport they had arrived in, with 27 coalition hostages and 1 large, apparently calm animal that had apparently decided, over the course of however many minutes of contact it had with the team, that cooperation was a better strategy than the alternative. Daria went to the medical bay where the hostages were being processed. They were shaken, exhausted, some of them had injuries from 3 weeks of karate custody. But they were alive. All 27 of them. She walked along the row of medical beds and counted them twice because she needed to see it with her own eyes. 27. She found Calloway in the corridor outside the medical bay, standing against the wall with her eyes closed, not asleep, just resting. The way a person rests who has learned to take 10 seconds of stillness whenever 10 seconds is available. Daria stopped in front of her. Calloway opened her eyes. Thank you, Daria said. It felt entirely inadequate. Calloway looked at her for a moment. They're your people too, she said. It was worth doing. Then her eyes shifted to something over Daria's shoulder, and the brief openness in her expression closed back to its professional neutrality, and Daria turned to see General Sorethvel coming down the corridor with 3 senior staff members and the particular walk of a person who has just been made to feel things they had not expected to feel and needs somewhere to put all of it. The debrief, Daria thought, was going to be something. She looked at the helmet cam footage later that night, in the security section, with the 15-second window that her clearance allowed. It showed a corridor. Guards at the near end, a sealed door at the far end. Then the timestamp jumped. The same corridor, unchanged except for one thing, the guards were gone. The lights were still on. The door was intact. The corridor was simply, completely, as if it had never held anyone at all, empty. 15 seconds. Daria sat in front of that display for a long time. The debrief was held in the Coalition's primary conference room at 1400 the following day. General Sorethvel had requested the session himself. Veth Carroll, seated along the side wall in his capacity as intelligence attaché, had never seen a Velthari general make a request that contained quite so much careful neutrality in its phrasing. Sorethvel was a highly experienced officer who had spent 40 years in Coalition service and had dealt with every species in the Coalition and several outside it. He was not a man who was easily unsettled. He was unsettled. The room held 23 people. 10 coalition senior officers representing 4 species. 3 diplomatic observers. 3 coalition intelligence analysts, Veth Carol among them. Daria Okonkwo, present in her liaison capacity, seated near the back. And 12 humans at one end of the long table, with Calloway at their center. Calloway had brought, Veth Carol noticed, a cup of coffee. She had apparently found somewhere on the station that made it to her satisfaction. She held it in both hands, and she did not look like someone who had completed a rescue operation 19 hours ago. She looked like someone who had slept well and was prepared to answer some questions. Sorethvel opened with the formal coalition after-action protocol. A summary of the objective, the timeline, the outcome. His voice was level and controlled throughout. When he reached the outcome summary, 27 hostages recovered, all coalition personnel accounted for, 0 permanent casualties on either side, he paused for a fraction of a second that Veth Carol suspected most people in the room did not notice. Veth Carol noticed. Then Sorethvel set down his notes and looked at Calloway directly. "Please walk us through the operation," he said. Calloway did. She was concise and clear, and she described what they had done in the specific measured language of a professional who has given many after-action reports and has learned to give exactly the amount of information that is needed without elaboration. Entry via the waste reclamation maintenance system, consistent with the facility cycle timing they had identified in the briefing. Infiltration through secondary storage, using a route that took advantage of the original construction's inconsistent sensor coverage in the junction between the old and new sections. Phase separation into 3 elements for simultaneous movement to the Paincaster positions, the hostage wing, and the facility control node. And the Paincasters, Sorethvel said, when she paused at that point. "Please explain the countermeasure." Calloway took a sip of coffee. Neural static emitters. Custom-built, calibrated to the Karate Paincaster frequency range. The Coalition's chief medical and biological science officer, a Brin named Tressavalin, leaned forward slowly. "The Paincaster frequency range is not in any Coalition technical database. The Karate have never permitted study of their biological weapons units." "Correct," Calloway said. "Then how?" "We have our own sources and our own research capacity." Tressavalin was quiet for a moment. Then he said, carefully, the implication being that Earth has independently researched and developed countermeasures for a biological weapon technology that the Coalition has had no access to. "Yes." Tressavalin looked at Sorethvel. Sorethvel's amber eyes were very still. Veth Carol was taking detailed notes, his hand moving quickly across his pad, and he was also watching every face in the room with the other part of his attention that always ran in parallel, cataloging reactions, storing them. The Velthari colonel to Sorethvel's left, a sharp-faced officer named Veth Soreth, no relation to the general, just a common name prefix, said, "I would like to understand the unit structure. What is the formal designation of this team within Earth's military organization?" Calloway looked at him. "That information is classified above the level of this session." "I appreciate that, but in the context of Coalition joint operations, a general understanding of." "Above the level of this session," Calloway said again. Pleasantly. Without any emphasis. Simply as a fact. Veth Soreth pressed his lips together. Sorethvel made a small gesture with one hand that meant, in Velthari nonverbal communication, stand down, and Veth Soreth sat back. "How many personnel are in your community?" Sorethvel asked. He used the word community deliberately, Veth Carol noted, because unit had just been closed off. Calloway considered this question for a moment. The specific quality of her consideration, brief, angled slightly, a small change in the focus of her eyes that meant she was deciding something, was one Veth Carol recognized. She was deciding how much of the truth to give. "Enough," she said, "that if you ever need this capability again, it will be available." The room was quiet for a moment. Then Colonel Veth Soreth said, 47 Karate garrison soldiers were found secured in a storage facility. Not injured significantly. Secured, he paused. By 12 personnel, against a garrison of 200, in a facility with no internal alarm function, another pause. Why were they not? He seemed to search for phrasing. Why were casualties not incurred? The team's medical specialist, the quiet man called Torres who had barely spoken in the briefing, looked up from his pad. Because it wasn't necessary, he said. His voice was mild and clear. The mission was to recover the hostages. Taking additional action against garrison personnel who had already been neutralized would not have served the mission. And some of them were frightened. The last sentence landed in a particular silence. Veth Carroll stopped writing. He read that sentence back in his mind twice. Not because he did not understand it. Because he wanted to sit with it for a moment. A military operator, in a hostile facility, in the middle of a covert recovery operation, had looked at the soldiers he was neutralizing and noticed that some of them were afraid. And that observation had factored into his decision-making. Not as a weakness to exploit. Not as irrelevant information. Just as a piece of the picture, weighed alongside everything else, and it had contributed to an outcome where 200 armed soldiers had been neutralized without permanent harm. Veth Carroll looked at his notes and thought about the 3 reports he had written. The career's worth of careful analysis. The frameworks and models and assessments. He thought about what Torres had just said and what it implied about the interior life of the people sitting at the end of this table, and he revised, quietly and significantly, his understanding of what these humans actually were. It was not the strength that was the thing. It was not the endurance, or the adaptability, or the remarkable capacity for operating in environments that should be prohibitive. All of those things were real and documented and impressive. The thing, the actual, central, defining thing, was the level of control. Any creature could be dangerous. Any creature, given enough pressure or training, could be made formidable. What was rare, what was almost unprecedented in Veth Carroll's extensive study of coalition species, was the combination of absolute capability and absolute restraint. The ability to do a great deal and the simultaneous constant choosing of exactly how much was appropriate. These 12 people had gone into a fortified installation against 20-fold odds and brought out everyone they came for and left the garrison zip-tied and frightened but breathing, because that was the correct outcome given the mission, and they had been precisely accurate to the mission the entire time. That was not aggression. That was something considerably more sophisticated than aggression. Sorethvel was speaking again, asking a question about the war beast, the creature that had apparently decided to cooperate, and that was currently residing in the station's secondary animal containment area in what everyone who had seen it described as a state of calm. Calloway explained, briefly, that Specialist Greer had experience with large fauna and had managed the situation without incident. She said this the way one says the words, without incident, when the incident in question is something no reasonable person would believe. Then the Velthari general did something Veth Carroll had never seen him do in 4 years of working alongside him. He put both hands flat on the table, a gesture that in Velthari culture meant open negotiation, vulnerability offered deliberately, and he said, "Master Sergeant Calloway, how many of these operations have you personally conducted?" Calloway looked at him for a moment. Then she said, "I stopped counting years ago." Sorethvel nodded, once, slowly, like someone confirming something they already suspected. "And in your professional estimation," he said, "are there others like you? Other humans, I mean, who have your kind of training and your kind of experience?" Calloway picked up her coffee. "There are a lot of humans," she said. The room was very quiet. Daria, in the back, was watching. She saw the coalition officers absorbing this. She saw the recalibration happening in real time on faces that were generally very good at not showing recalibration. She saw Veth Carroll writing fast, head slightly down, and she saw Sorethvel's expression settle into something that was part respect and part something else, not quite unease, but the look of a person who has just revised their model of the world and is deciding how to live with the revision. She thought about 11 years of coalition membership. She thought about all the conflicts and the reputations and the stories that the galaxy told about human soldiers. The Velthari word for them. The Keth word for them. The briefing in Bryn military curricula. She thought about Calloway finding her in the corridor outside the medical bay and saying, very simply, "They're your people too." She thought about what it meant that the thing the galaxy feared, human soldiers who would not stop, was just the surface. Just the most visible layer of something that went considerably deeper, and had considerably more control, and was considerably more purposeful than anything the galaxy had yet imagined. After the session ended, Veth Carroll found her in the corridor. "I need to update my reports," he said. "How significant is the update?" He thought about this for a moment. His gray-green skin had darkened at the edges, the Drell stress signal, and she did not think the stress was fear. She thought it was the specific tension of a person whose professional understanding has been productively challenged and who is still processing the implications. The first report will need to be substantially rewritten, he said. The second will need a new framework entirely. The third, he paused, I may need to speak with my director about the classification level before I can write the third. Daria nodded. Sergeant Okonkwo, he said, as she started to walk away. Did you know? Before this operation. Did you know what they were? She considered being diplomatic. Then she thought about Calloway, and about Torres saying some of them were frightened, and about the 15 seconds of corridor footage, and she decided that honesty was more useful. I knew they were something, she said. I did not know the shape of it. And now? Now, she said, I have a slightly better idea of the shape. And a much better appreciation for how much shape there is left. She left him in the corridor and went to find Calloway. 6 months is not a long time in galactic history. In coalition politics, where decisions move at the pace of consensus among dozens of species and hundreds of competing interests, 6 months is barely enough time to schedule a follow-up meeting. And yet in the 6 months after the recovery of the Citadel Neth hostages, something shifted in the way the galaxy understood humanity, and the shift was wide enough and deep enough that even the people who managed these things for a living could feel it. Daria felt it every day. She was assigned, 2 months after Citadel Neth, as a senior liaison to the Coalition's new Joint Human Species Task Force, an initiative that had been discussed in various planning documents for years and had never quite gotten funded until the week after the debrief. She had expected the assignment to involve a lot of meetings, a lot of careful language, a lot of the diplomatic friction that came with trying to get very different species to work together toward common goals. There was some of that. There always was. But there was also this: she was standing in a training observation bay on the Coalition's third-tier station, watching a Velthari Special Operations Squad run drills alongside 4 human rangers, and a Velthari officer she had never met before stopped next to her and said, without any preamble or introduction, "Your soldiers are remarkable." Not the way people had said it before. Not with the mixture of awe and unease that used to underlie the compliment, the admission of something troubling. This Velthari officer said it the way you talk about something you have studied carefully and want to understand better. There was open curiosity in his translated voice. There was, underneath that, what Daria recognized as respect without reservation. "They're pretty good," Daria said. "We have requested a training attachment," he said. 3 of our officers, 6 months with a human unit. Earth Command approved it last week. She knew. The attachment request was one of 7 that had come in since Citadel Neth, 7 different species, all wanting to learn. Not to study humans from a safe analytical distance, the way Veth Carroll had spent 14 years doing, though Veth Carroll was now her colleague and she considered him a friend, and she would not say that to his face because it would make him very formally uncomfortable. This was different. This was people who had seen what was possible and wanted to understand how to be closer to it. The first time she processed a training attachment request, Daria had felt something that surprised her. Not pride exactly. Something quieter than pride. Something that had to do with what it meant that for 11 years the galaxy had feared humanity, and now, not instead of fear, but alongside it, woven through it, something like understanding was beginning to grow. The karate envoy arrived on a Tuesday. She had been told he was coming. She had not been told who it was, and when she saw him walk through the arrival gate and recognized the bearing of the Citadel Neth commander from the intelligence images she had studied before the operation, she stopped walking and stared for a moment before her professional instincts caught up with her surprise. His name, she learned from the translation aide, was Kethvor Nal. He was 70 years old by standard reckoning, which made him middle-aged for a karate. He had commanded fortress defense operations for 23 years. He had never lost a position in his career. He was wearing a simple gray civilian tunic with a single stripe of color at the collar that indicated senior military service. He found her in the reception corridor and introduced himself with a formal karate gesture, both hands open, turned outward, which she had been briefed meant something between transparency and vulnerability, offered respectfully. She returned the human equivalent, which her cultural briefing packet described as a firm handshake. He took her hand carefully, feeling the grip, and his broad-set dark eyes were thoughtful. "You were monitoring the operation," he said. "The communication station." "Yes," she said. "I would like to understand," he said, "what happened. Not the tactics. I have studied the tactics. I understand the entry point, the timing, the methods. He paused. I would like to understand how 12 people decided that 200 was not an obstacle. Daria looked at him for a moment. That's a long conversation, she said. I requested a 6-month attachment, he said. I have time. She thought about this. She thought about what it meant that the commander of the Citadel Neth garrison, a man who had spent his career believing that force and fortress were the ultimate answers, had requested this posting personally. Had come here specifically because he needed to understand something that had happened to him that his existing framework could not explain. I can introduce you to some people, she said. They might be able to help you with that conversation. The same people, he asked. The ones from the operation. Probably not the same 12, she said. But the same kind. He nodded, slowly, and she saw something in his expression that she understood because she had felt it herself, standing in the observation bay 6 months ago watching an unmarked transport dock in silence. The combination of apprehension and genuine need to know. The feeling of being at the edge of a much larger thing than you had previously understood. She would set up the meeting. She already knew Calloway was on the station. She had her own posting now, some senior advisory role that Daria did not have full clearance to know the scope of, which seemed entirely appropriate. Calloway would find the conversation interesting or she would not, and either way she would say exactly as much as was useful and no more, which was exactly what Kethvor and Al needed. The SCYR situation had been building for 3 months. Daria had been tracking it on the intelligence feeds the way you track weather on a long ocean voyage, not expecting to be surprised, but wanting to see what shape the storm took when it arrived. The SCYR were a species she knew only from the Coalition's contact databases. They were large, technologically advanced, socially organized around hierarchy and dominance expression, and they had been expanding along the Coalition's outer border in a way that the Coalition's diplomatic corps had been describing as a trajectory of concern for 18 months. Their high command had, apparently, done a threat assessment of the Coalition's military capacity. The assessment had given significant weight to the species-by-species breakdown of combat profiles. Daria had read the intelligence summary of the SCYR document, which was an uncomfortable experience. The SCYR assessment described humanity as, and she was quoting the translated text directly, the soft species. Flesh-bodied, short-lived by galactic standards, biologically unremarkable, easily disrupted by standard weapons and environmental stress. Their soldiers demonstrate unusual endurance parameters but are fundamentally limited by the frailty of their physical form. They do not constitute a significant deterrent. She had read that summary twice. Then she had sent a message to Gareth Cole, the lieutenant who had been in the monitoring room with her at Citadel Neth, because she knew he would appreciate it. He had written back a single line, "They always say that." They always did. That was the thing about being human in the Coalition. You could never quite make anyone understand from the outside. You had to show them. And the showing was always more thorough than anyone anticipated. The SCYR were massing along the outer border. The Coalition's diplomatic response was underway. And Earth Command had done its own assessment of the situation and sent a message to the task force that Daria read in the quiet of her office at 0600 on a morning that otherwise felt completely ordinary. The message said that a team was being dispatched to assist with Coalition border assessment and contingency planning. Standard language. The attachment said that the team manifest was available to senior liaison personnel at her clearance level, which meant it was not classified above her. For the first time in her experience with this particular community, she opened the manifest with the specific feeling of someone who is not sure whether they want to know and knows they're going to look anyway. 12 names. Different 12 from Citadel Neth, as she had expected. After each name, a brief unclassified summary of specialization. She read the first 3 and felt the familiar fine hair sensation on her arms. She read the 4th and had to set down her coffee. She read the 5th and 6th and took a slow breath. She read through to the 12th and then she sat for a while with the manifest in front of her and did not immediately move. Then she went to find Veth Carroll. He was in his office, which was covered in documents, physical documents, actual paper, which was an unusual preference for a Drell but which he had explained once was related to the way his memory worked, the ability to look at the whole picture at once. She had never quite understood it but she had stopped remarking on it. She handed him the manifest without explanation. He read it. She watched his skin darken, first the edges, then spreading inward, the deep stress response color that she had learned to read as not fear but intense cognitive engagement. He read it twice. Then he set it down and looked at her. This specialization list, he said. Yes. The third person on this list has 3 combat environments listed that do not exist anywhere in the Coalition's territory. I know. Which means they were trained for environments they had never operated in. Or, she said carefully, environments that are coming. He was quiet for a moment, looking at the manifest. Then he said, the fourth person. This specialization. I know. And the 9th. Veth. Yes. I know. He sat back in his chair and looked at the ceiling for a moment, which was not a Drell gesture she recognized but which she had observed him making when he was working through a very large implication. Then he looked at her again. Sergeant Okonkwo. The SCYR assessment of human military capacity describes humanity as the soft species. Yes. And Earth Command's response to the SCYR border situation is to send 12 people. Yes. 12 people who collectively represent specialization profiles that would require a standard coalition force of several hundred to replicate. Broadly, yes. He looked at the manifest one more time. Then he closed it, with the care of someone handling something that deserves to be handled carefully, and he said, I think I need to finish writing my third report. She left him to it and walked to the observation deck. She went there often now. It was the same deck where she had stood 6 months ago and watched the dark and felt the anticipation of something coming. The star looked different at this angle in the morning, casting long shadow shapes across the station's external structure. A coalition patrol vessel moved through the approach corridor in slow silence. She thought about Kethvor Nal, who had come here to understand something that had broken his existing model of the world, and who was going to spend 6 months learning that the model was not just broken but had been built on a misread of the evidence from the start. She thought about Veth Carroll, who had spent 14 years studying the surface of a thing and was now, finally, beginning to write about what lived underneath. She thought about the 7 training attachment requests, the 7 species who had decided that proximity was better than distance when it came to understanding this particular set of people. She thought about the SCYR. She thought about 12 people on a transport somewhere, with specialization profiles that suggested they had been prepared for things that had not happened yet. She thought about the word enough, said pleasantly in a briefing room in response to a question about numbers. She thought about Torres saying some of them were frightened, and the way that sentence had changed every understanding in the room. She pressed her hand against the glass. The dark outside was the same dark it had always been. The stars were the same stars. But the way she looked at all of it was different now, and she knew it was different, and she thought that might be the most important part of everything that had happened in the past 6 months. Not the operation. Not the outcome. Not the manifest she had just read. The fact that she was seeing more clearly. Calloway found her 20 minutes later, which did not entirely surprise her. Calloway had a habit of finding people at moments that seemed coincidental but probably were not. She stood beside Daria at the glass and looked at the dark for a while without speaking. Then she said, the SCYR situation. Yes, Daria said. You read the manifest? Yes. Thoughts? Daria considered this. 6 months ago she would have said something careful, something diplomatic, something that acknowledged the complexity and the risk. She was a different officer now than she had been 6 months ago. Not in the obvious ways, same rank, same posting, same job. But different inside, in the place where assessments are made. I feel sorry for them, she said. The SCYR. They made the same mistake everyone makes. Calloway looked at her sideways. What mistake is that? They looked at what we are and thought they understood what we could do. Calloway was quiet for a moment. The galaxy thought it knew us, Daria continued. 11 years, 7 conflicts, all these studies and reports and assessments. They thought they had the picture. They had a picture, Calloway said. And Citadel Neth showed them there was a bigger picture. Yes. And the manifest I just read suggests there is a bigger picture behind that one. Calloway did not answer directly. She looked at the dark in that calm, focused way she had, the deep water way that Veth Carroll had once tried to describe to Daria and had finally given up on because no language he knew had quite the right word for it. Then she said, quietly, we have been doing this for a very long time. Longer than we have been in the coalition. Longer than anyone has been watching us. We have been building this, quietly, carefully, generation after generation, because we understood something early that most species never have to learn. What's that? Daria asked. That the universe does not care how hard things are, Calloway said. It only cares whether you were ready. Daria looked at the stars. She thought about every soldier who had come before her. Every person who had stood in a hard place and decided, in that moment that could not be prepared for and yet had been prepared for all along, to keep going anyway. The Rangers on Ridgeline 9. The operations that officially did not happen. The 12 in the unmarked transport. The ones coming now. The ones after those. The long, quiet, patient work of a species that had understood, from very early on, that the universe was large and indifferent and full of things that had not been encountered yet, and had made a particular kind of peace with that fact, and had continued anyway. The galaxy feared human soldiers. Then it met the ones nobody was supposed to know about. And now, slowly, carefully, it was beginning to understand that the fear and the respect and the careful recalibration were all pointing at the same thing, a species that did not treat the unknown as a reason to stop. A species that looked at impossible and asked what the sewage cycle was. A species that went still and quiet before the hardest thing, not because it was not aware of the difficulty, but because it had already decided. Daria kept her hand on the glass. The SCYR called us the soft species, she said. They always do, Calloway said. They have no idea. No, Calloway agreed. They do not. They stood there together for a while, the two of them, watching the dark between the stars where 12 unremarkable people were traveling towards something the galaxy had not yet learned to be appropriately concerned about. And the stars were cold and distant and the station hummed around them and everything was, for the moment, quiet. The quiet never lasted. Daria had learned that. But she had also learned, over 11 years and 1 extraordinary 6 months, that the quiet was not emptiness. It was preparation. It was the stillness before the decision. It was the 4 minutes and 17 seconds of looking at a schematic before asking the question nobody else had thought to ask. It was 12 ordinary-looking people walking off a transport with their bags and their cards and their paperback novels, going calmly toward the thing everyone else had decided could not be done. The galaxy feared human soldiers. Good, Daria thought. They should.